Adam Lockyer is a defence strategist at the US Studies Centre. He joins us in the studio. Adam, good to see you. Let's first put this up against the 2009 white paper in terms of the strategy in the region. As we mentioned earlier, in the 2009 paper, Australia was fairly aggressive towards China. How would you summarise the stance now?
This is a far more conservative document in terms of both the language and its ambitions for Australia's role in the region. So we're aligning closely with the United States and also with partners in the region to try to leverage cooperation there, but at the same time we're trying to align more with our goals with our capabilities. So what we had in 2009, we had very ambitious goals, but after then we didn't have the money to back those up. So what this is trying to do is align the goals more closely with what we can afford.
So you're saying it's an outbreak of realism in this world of budgetary constraints?
Well, maybe pragmatism is a better word. So what they're trying to do is saying that, well, we can't afford these big, ambitious projects that the 2009 white paper hinted at. We can't afford these major increases in defence spending. What we need to do is align our strategy with what Australia can afford in these tighter fiscal circumstances. And so in that sense, it's more of a conservative document, and the language is now matching those aims as well.
The US, of course, is also facing its own budgetary problems. Now, you've made the point that as the US scales down its military budget, its allies need to step up.
So this year, the United States is trying to find cuts of $42 billion from its defence budget, and it's running around trying to find these cuts, and it's really struggling. So in the future, what we're probably going to see is the United States not going to be able to do everything everywhere all the time, and it's going to have to rely more closely on its allies to do certain roles. Now, up until this point, it's expected its allies, particularly South Korea, Japan and Australia, those more advanced countries with more capabilities, to more or less supplement its own capabilities. So these countries are expected to buy the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and those purchases are supposed to supplement the Americans' purchase of the same fighter. Now, what they could be doing, however, is a greater division of labour. So instead of always just trying to supplement each other's capabilities, perhaps trying to divide the labour between the allies. So the United States might be doing more the high-end level capabilities, whereas Australia and its allies might be doing some more of the low-end missions.
This comes at a time, the Prime Minister this morning said the regional strategy now is very much a focus on Indo-Pacific. That, of course, also aligns itself with the pivot that the US has turned towards Asia. So are those two very similar strategies, and what is China to make of this?
Yeah, so the wording's key here. So the United States always likes to talk about the Pacific century, and by the Pacific century, what it means is it's still going to be America's century. It's going to take the lead, but it's going to be facing more attention towards the Pacific and Asia. Whereas, say, the earlier white paper this year, which came out of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, spoke about the Asian century. And by the Asian century, they're really talking about China. So how is Australia and its neighbours going to react to the rise of China? This document talks more about Indo-Pacific, and there they're bringing in India as well. So how is the relationship between India, China and the United States going to play out in the region, and what's Australia's role going to be in that relationship?
We also had the Indonesian president overnight talking about his country's military capabilities and making the point that it needs to be stronger than other countries such as Australia. What sort of signal is he sending to the region?
Well, he's signalling the same message that you're hearing right across the region. So last year, Asia, for the first time in modern history, outspent Europe in defence spending. So the Europeans have this era of austerity. They're cutting back across the board, particularly in defence. Whereas you see defence budgets right across Asia expanding rapidly. Now, this is not an arms race. This is just that the percentage of their GDP is matching the rise. So they're able to afford greater capabilities because they're becoming richer. And this is not just a story about China. This is a story about Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. This is a story that goes way beyond that. And so what you're seeing for the first time is that Australia's defence capabilities may not be able to match those of its neighbours. So over the past few decades, we've been able to rely upon generations of fighter aircraft that far more advanced than its neighbours. That may not be the case anymore. With the purchase of MiG-29s and Su-27s by Indonesia, they're more or less the equivalent of our Super Hornets. So we can't rely upon that qualitative difference anymore.
There's also very much focus on Australia's naval capabilities. A lot of defence analysts saying that's where the focus needs to be. We heard the announcement this morning on the Collins-class submarine. They're not taking anything off the shelf now. They're looking at either redeveloping the Collins-class or turning to a new class of submarine. No surprise there as far as that focus is concerned?
No real surprise. So the Collins, of course, had a very troubled birth. It had many difficulties early on. Now, those problems have largely been worked out. So a lot of the bugs in the system have painfully and expensively been worked out. So it does make some sense to use, to purchase a more advanced Collins class that we've already got experience with. Now, the problems with our current submarine fleet isn't necessarily with the machines themselves. It's often with crewing them because it's difficult work in cramped spaces, and many of the skills that you need to crew a submarine are the exact same skills you need in the mines. And so many of the crew have a short tenure in the Navy, and then they go off to the mines and make loads of money. So it's actually about personnel more than the machines at this stage, and keeping a lot of our submarine fleet out at sea.
And if we look at Australia's air defences, obviously there are orders for the Joint Strike Fighter, the US fighter, which has had its problems. That now looks as though they'll be in service by 2020. That's another 7 years away. So to plug that gap, the government has announced that it will be purchasing a Growler aircraft rather than converting its Super Hornets. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so what the Growler is a stopgap. It was never the ideal. So what the government, back in the Howard government days, had planned, had envisaged, was as they start to withdraw the F-111 and the older F-18s from service, that the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter would come in and fill the gap, and would have a one-plane type of plane fleet. This is not the ideal. So now we're going to have three different types of planes: the Super Hornet, plus the Growler, plus the F-35 when and if they arrive. So what the Growler is doing is it's just a stopgap. It's just until the F-35 arrives, and it's not the ideal, but this is what the government has been dealt. Because, like Stephen Smith was saying, these decisions with the problems with the F-35 are outside of Australia's hands. It's all happening in the States, and the problems with its development are things that are completely out of Australia's hands.
Does this white paper take into account, obviously, what the world order is at the moment and Australia's defence capabilities? What if there was a new conflict that emerged? How is Australia in the position to handle such a conflict? Obviously, that's very speculative. I'm not saying we know what that conflict is, obviously, but would it be stretched beyond its current capabilities if there was a new outbreak?
It depends on the mission. So ever since the late 1990s, ever since East Timor, Australia has been primarily structuring its defence force to replay East Timor. So everything from the air warfare destroyers, they're mostly about, they're envisioning a conflict like East Timor where you need to put up air defences over a small island and make sure a large neighbour doesn't come in and have air superiority over your soldiers. The amphibious missions, the amphibious vehicles, they're all about refighting East Timor. So that's a mission Australia has been moving steadily towards, and we're in a much better position now to replay East Timor than we were back when East Timor happened. The problem, though, is that we're unlikely to face East Timor ever again. We're likely to face either missions like Afghanistan, where we need to rely heavily on our special forces and our commandos and light infantry, and this white paper tends to be still sort of plugging away at these higher end capabilities like our aircraft, like our air warfare destroyers, to refight East Timor rather than probably what we're more likely to see.
Okay, we've been talking about hardware, the government looking at some new purchases, obviously. What about manpower? Now, I made the comparison before with the Indonesian government. They have an armed forces of some 480,000 men and women. Compare that with Australia, some 80,000. And Australia has had a history of struggling, perhaps, if you like, to fill those gaps in its defence force, attracting quality candidates. Is that going to be an issue in the future, how you actually maintain the manpower of Australia's defences?
Yeah, it's an enduring problem within the Australian defence community. How do you get the right type of people into defence? And things in this white paper, they've spoken about the force posture review, and this is about sending army battalions further north. This is probably not good for retention. Nobody really wants to live there, and if you need to pick up a young family and move to far north Queensland, up to Northern Territory or West Australia, this is going to be a problem, going to put strains on these young families. So moves like this are probably not in the best interest of retention. They're doing this because they want to put more force further north and cover Australia's supposed northern approaches. But this is probably not a good move for retention, and it's probably not a good move in general because most army personnel want to live closer to the larger cities, and if there is ever a threat to Australia's northern approaches, we're going to have more than ample warning to move forces, pick them up and move them north.
Can they compensate with technology?
They can, and there is some talk about the purchase of UAVs in the future.
UAVs being?
Unmanned aerial vehicles, so these are the drones. And so we'll probably see increasing use of these, to cover the northern approaches and be able to give Australia greater warning if there's anything occurring further north, and be able to move forces north. So I'm not really sure that the force posture about stationing a large number of our military personnel way up north is necessarily a good thing, mostly for retention purposes, but I don't think it's strategically important.
Adam Lockyer, thanks very much.
Thank you.